Assalamu alaikum.
Ji, Assalamualaikum.
Welcome to the PIDE webinar. We are about to begin, Ji. My name is Nadeemul Haq. We are going to talk about catalyzing capital for fast growth, SMEs. How do we achieve significant scale and reach? Our speaker is Umar Javed Ghani, specialist with HEC, a well-known individual, and a creative young man who's done many creative things in Pakistan. Umar Ghani has done this research with HEC, so we would love to hear what he's done. So with that, over to you, Umar. Please start.
Sir, thank you, first of all, giving me an opportunity. It's an honor to be part of this platform and to be able to share my thoughts with your audience and your network. Just a point of clarification, the research that I'm doing with HEC is a complete mapping report on the knowledge innovation ecosystem that will be published hopefully by World Bank next week. We have already started disseminating that report, but today's session really is not that part of research, but this is certainly something that links with that research. So
before you go on, I must ask a question. I find this quite amazing that HEC is an apex body for the creation of knowledge in Pakistan. HEC is supposed to be regulating all our universities. And yet, the research that you've done for the HEC is going to be published by the World Bank. I have never heard of a study done by Harvard or Oxford or whatever being published by the World Bank. Is this part of a new colonial mentality?
Sorry about that. No, it's a very potent and very important question. Why are the donors coming in and funding these studies, and what is happening with our local policymakers and stakeholders? Why are they not funding these kinds of studies? It happens so that this is a World Bank funded initiative, and all the outputs that we're generating from this program, we're using the World Bank's global network to disseminate that information. So when I said World Bank is going to publish it, doesn't mean that we can't publish it. It's HEC's property. It's HEC's report, and HEC has already started disseminating to all its universities. But ultimately, we'd also want this research to go out to all other policy stakeholders of this knowledge innovation ecosystem. And we'll be certainly using HEC platform for that. I'm just a consultant advising HEC in establishing some of these funds through which we are giving out these grants, doing some capacity building activities for our incubators and RX, and also doing some research like this research that I carried out. So hope that answers your question. Ji. So the study that I had done for HEC, essentially, I went around 100 universities and collected a lot of information from universities on what kind of commercializable research activities were taking place, what kind of technologies, what kind of startups, what was the impact over the last 10 years of all of this research, technology creation, startups. And I captured all of that in this report. A lot of primary data was collected. Today's session is actually on catalyzing capital for fast growth SMEs in Pakistan, in which grants can only play a certain role. Subsidies can only play a certain role. And most of my focus in today's conversation is where do we get the commercial sources of capital? What is required? What are the systematic barriers? What are the barriers at the transactional and operational level that need to be addressed to catalyze that capital and reach the scale that is required to meet the demand for capital by the SMEs in Pakistan? Right. So just wanted to clarify that this is not, this research is not part of the research done in HEC. I've been leading I've led about almost over 24 national level assignments covering almost all key economic sectors from agriculture to housing to renewable energy. And SME has been one of my keen focus for the last decade, in which I also helped establish a DFI for State Bank called the Pakistan SME Credit Guarantee Company. And part of the feasibility study and the business planning that I was doing for that SME Credit Guarantee Company, I collected a lot of data. And anyway, so this research has been going on in the SME space for a while. And I'm pretty close to finalizing this research paper also that I would love to get your feedback on as we move along. The contents of the presentation today, we will look at 4 driving questions, which we essentially need to answer to be able to solve this problem of catalyzing commercial capital or concessional capital, perhaps, for SMEs in Pakistan. We need to first look at the current capital deployed in Pakistan and then evaluate some promising approaches and also then identify potential new capital sources and instruments, innovative instruments that can ultimately unlock this capital and meet the demand supply gap in SME segment. Finally, I summarize this presentation with some calls to action. What exactly we need to do? What are the action steps that we need to take? Right. My research work over the last decade has centered on how to spur significant scaling up of investment in small, medium enterprises in Pakistan over the coming 3 to 5 years. The focus of this research was on approaches and initiatives that best serve the need for the real economy SMEs in Pakistan. The research and call to action are grounded in 4 driving questions. The current capital deployed, what is the amount of capital supporting SMEs in Pakistan, promising approaches, which are most promising approaches to increasing capital, which institutions would provide a step change in finance, and what is required to see the asset owners invest more capital. And as we move along, we'll try to build the business case centered around these 4 driving questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in building a business case for SMEs. Almost everyone, I think, unanimously agrees that SME is a very key segment of our economy, and we must not ignore it anymore. And we must do something proactively to support and accelerate this sector. The company that I was heading for the last almost a decade, we are behind the creation of majority of the microfinance institutions, having led the widening harmonized access to microfinance project that gave birth to a lot of microfinance institutions, Pakistan Microfinance Network, and a whole host of other activities. We were also the shareholders in Kashaf, privatized Khoshali Bank, NRSP, Dr. Shoaib Sultan Sahab, when he was thinking of doing something, our organization was hired to develop a strategic blueprint, bring in our investors, establish an RSP. We transformed a division of our Rule Support Program into FMFP. Finca, we brought into Pakistan. I advised them in their digital transformation. Easy Pesa, we raised about $6 million. Omni was my project. I implemented end-to-end for Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. So we were able to establish a microfinance industry. Commercial banks were already operative. They were looking at the top end of the real economy spectrum. But the missing middle, SME, remained ignored. And I believe we need to take lessons of how we were able to create a sustainable microfinance industry and try to replicate some of that in creating a sustainable SME finance industry as well, which remains by and large missing. Generally, there's an underappreciation and lack of interest in financing the moderate growth SMEs in emerging markets, and the situation in Pakistan also is very similar. So when we look at the whole life cycle journey of an enterprise, which starts essentially from a blueprint, which is an idea, concept, or a business plan, without a tested product or service, without tested or revenue, ultimately you want to take that idea and concept and validate that idea and concept, create a product, do a proof of concept. Ultimately, once you've done a proof of concept, establish the company and then prepare it for scale. These are different stages of growth in the life cycle of a company, of any enterprise, whether it's fast growth or moderate growth or low growth enterprise, but they all go through these stages. And at each node in the life cycle journey of a startup, there's a need for a certain type of funding. At the earlier stage, perhaps attracting commercial capital is very difficult. So the need for subsidy and grant funds, but in a way that we don't distort the markets and we create some multiplier effect. For every penny of grant money that is being spent, if we can mobilize commercial capital, maybe in a ratio of 1 to 2, 1 to 3. In the Pakistan SME Credit Guarantee Company, the regulatory framework that I gave to State Bank, the ceiling for the multiplier was set at 10. So every penny of subsidy that the government puts into the Pakistan SME Credit Guarantee Company, and that SME Credit Guarantee Company can then go out and issue non-cash guarantees to banks or NBFIs or private equity funds. It can essentially mobilize up to $10 for every $1 of non-cash guarantee. That means it can generate a multiplier of almost 10. So government, rather than spending money in subsidies under Kamyab Jawan or just spending grants, on a one-to-one ratio, can use this vehicle, can use this policy instrument to generate a multiplier effect without distorting the markets, and then creating the market infrastructure that is required to sustainably carry out that mission forward. Because हुकूमत का काम नहीं है कि आके पैसे स्पेंड करे और करती जाए, खत्म होंगे तो फिर क्या होएगा? अगर उसी पैसे से वो अपने मार्केट पार्टिसिपेंट्स को तैयार कर लेती है और मार्केट कैपिटल को मोबिलाइज कर लेती है और उनको एक अपॉर्चुनिटी दिखाती है किस तरीके से वो सस्टेनेबली इस चीज को फंड कर सकते हैं आगे, then they will continue doing it. And while I created this company about 3 years back, some political mess essentially held the operationalization of this company. And till date, it's been 4 years, this company has not been operationalized, even though there's $60+ million worth of capital from DFID sitting in state bank account that just needs to be transferred to this company. $40 million have been committed by other donors. With $100 million, this company can be going out and mobilizing almost close to $1 billion worth of capital for the SME segment and startups in Pakistan. But yet, political issues are holding operationalizing this company. And the CEO of this company has now left this company after waiting for 3 years for this operationalization and gone to Saudi SME Credit Guarantee Company to lead it. It was also part of the PTI's 100-day agenda. And unfortunate that while having this strong policy instrument out there in the market, we're not using it for our purpose. I've also defined a target SME segment, which is my interest at the moment, fast growth SMEs, because the space of SME is huge, and we need to start somewhere where we have the highest chance of delivering impact and success and maximum impact, in fact. And that's why I'm focusing on those fast growth SMEs. And recently in a survey, I've collected a lot of data and understanding what kind of financial needs they have and what kind of investment sizes they need and what kind of terms are they willing to offer to investors. And I'll be sharing all of that data in the form of a report once it's finalized, hopefully in the next coming days. This presentation is also essentially almost derived from that research, but that since research is not complete, I can't share the research data in this presentation as yet. This is the complete capital chain of value chain for capital that I was talking about, from blueprint, validate, prepare to scale. This study was done by the Monitor Group, and this is a widely accepted value chain used by almost most emerging economies that are trying to mobilize domestic capital for impact and innovation. There are various instruments, commercial capital instruments available in our and other economies. Debt, equity, mezzanine, grant, guarantees, and then lots of hybrid instruments which have features resembling each one of these instruments are also now in vogue in different parts of the world, where startups have been able to use these innovative instruments to connect with investors much faster than the plain vanilla equity and debt instruments. For example, convertible debt or safe note. Lots of startups in the early stage don't have the valuation to go out and raise the kind of capital they need in the form of equity, because that ends up diluting them. But they can use safe notes and convertible notes without diluting themselves, without having a valuation event early stage in their life cycle journey when the valuation is not justifying it. And later on, once they reach a certain valuation or there's a valuation event, they can give those financial sponsors who are giving them capital through convertible notes at the valuation event. Whatever valuation you do, you can give them a discount upfront in the convertible note. So lots of these instruments have been used very, very effectively by startups all over the world. But in our country, also startups have been using these instruments, but mostly with foreign investors. And historically, foreign investors were kind of penalized by State Bank, and there were lots of restrictions on them. Recently, State Bank have come up with some policy reforms inviting and allowing foreign investors to transact with local startups using these notes. But point is that there are many other innovations that need to happen. SSCP has also recently finalized their startup policy, and they've started a sandbox initiative, and they've allowed some innovative activities to happen, and crowdfunding has been one of them. But SSCP and other regulators generally are very, very restrictive in terms of initially allowing the markets to develop and then coming to regulate them. They choose the other course, which is they start regulating it before the markets even develop. And for example, in the sandbox period, we were basically asked the issuers who were trying to raise money through investors to the crowdfunding platform to basically underwrite that risk, to basically guarantee a minimum return to investors. How can startups do that? Startups typically don't have collaterals, and if they were asked to provide guarantee on principal and minimum return to investors who are coming to the crowdfunding platform, that defeats the whole purpose. So anyway, this is the entire spectrum of universe of all the different innovations across the life cycle. We need to bring in different sources of capital at different nodes. So at the earlier stage, I mean, generally because there's lack of equity in mezzanine in Pakistan, what we see is that there are some DFIs and grants and donor money supporting startups at the early stage. But as soon as that grant cycle completes, we then try to push the banks to come and start financing, giving them credit. Credit is the last instrument. I mean, generally, most of these startups are not ready to take on credit, and banks generally are not there to punt on startups and invest in risky asset classes. So you need to bring in some risk capital and perhaps get the governance structures improved and establish the teams and build some track record before you can approach banks to avail credit. And banks will use their own underwriting criteria to evaluate what are the repayment capacities on a loan portfolio on debt for those startups before they can assign a credit limit and give that funding. So just creating a program, political program, Kamyab Jawan, and then asking State Bank to start dispersing does not work. Previously also, we've seen many such programs being announced, but they're not able to mobilize capital because banks typically use their own underwriting criteria. And if they see a commercial opportunity to finance a business, they will. If they don't, they won't. Only a few very small segment, which is basically on the spectrum where banks are not able to take a decision where some collateral deficiency, a credit guarantee or some kind of a subsidy will make them tilt their bet. In the current capital deployed, when I started digging out data, I realized that there's a capital deployment to SMEs in Pakistan in terms of debt, equity, mezzanine, and grant capital, but the data is very scarce. And anecdotally, people say that there are not many players targeting this group specifically, and by and large, all the key informant interviews and focus groups that we've had, everyone's kind of complaining that there are not very many players who support SMEs in Pakistan, which is why we call them missing middle. Supply side data gaps as far as the amounts of AUM of debt, amounts of AUM of equity and mezzanine, the amount of grant capital deployed annually from foundations, development finance institutions, SME funds, banks, non-banking financial institutions, and also the supply side data gaps as far as the return that investors have realized on capital deployed, both in hard currency and local currency across different asset classes, and their opportunity cost of coming into this asset class, which is the fast for SMEs or startups. Is lacking. And my primary motivation to start this research was to collect and organize all of this data so that we can take informed decisions. Similarly, we have gaps on the demand side, the amount of debt the target markets of SMEs required to grow and on what terms, the amount of equity and mezzanine financing they require on what terms, the amount of grant capital they require, both in terms of direct grants, technical assistance, the realistic returns, the capacity building needs, all of this information while exists, but it's fragmented in pockets, and there is not one single document or data repository which collects this data and disseminates that data to all key stakeholders who are working on this mission to unlock capital for SMEs in Pakistan. We have some numbers taken from a recent Galvanize study on the NPLs, on the SME finance, which has gone down drastically to now it stands at about 6.6% of the total private sector credit book in the country. The SME borrowers are about 178,000, which is quite astonishing given the size of the SME segment in Pakistan. The outstanding SME portfolio is about 443.8 billion, which has also gone down. So what do we need to do to increase this capital? I have evaluated a whole number of different models, from accelerator link funds to which is multi-channel, to asset-backed financing, to essentially creating a blueprint for a model SME unit or an SME bank within a larger commercial bank. You can establish an SME unit. They're SME units, but the way they're going about doing business is, perhaps not the way a typical SME unit should be behaving. We need to do a whole lot of things from inclusion of technology to exploring alternate delivery channels to just reinventing the whole business case for SMEs, because in SMEs you go out and give small tickets as opposed to the larger corporates where you can you can disperse a large amount of credit with one client. Here you have to identify many smaller clients to be able to disperse that. So the business models have to be reinvented, and currently the business models are not optimal and optimized and efficient, which is creating a lot of inefficiency. Similarly, I've explored crowdfunding. I was actually part of the sandbox, which was testing the crowdfunding pilot for SCCP. And I have some reservations with the current mindset of the regulator and also the readiness of the industry. So this perhaps channel is very useful and needs to be developed, but Pakistan is developing crowdfunding very late. Majority of the countries in this region around the world started this initiative many years back and now have vibrant crowdfunding markets. Players, startups raising significant amounts of capital from crowdfunding platforms. And it will also take some time for us before we're able to develop these markets. But having a reliance that SCCP has launched a current sandbox and there's a crowdfunding opportunity that we'll be able to solve all our problems, we may not. Flexible debt instruments are critical. Banks need to now innovate on financial instruments. The plain vanilla instruments with rigid, where the structuring is not done keeping in mind the cash flow cyclicality of SMEs that you are supporting. The back-end infrastructure of banks does not cater to this cyclicality. Creating variable payment obligations or flexible debt instruments where the SMEs or the borrowers pay when they have cash, and when they don't, they are given the leeway not to pay cash. And similarly, your risk frameworks and IT backend infrastructure at banks is developed to support these kinds of instruments. Currently, our banks do not have the capacity to roll out these kinds of instruments, which is very, very critical for supporting SME finance. Most of the capital in my study, what I've observed is that we need to be able to reinvent the way our existing incumbent players who are dealing with SMEs are dealing with SMEs. We need to help them reinvent their ways. So because most of the initial capital will come from those, and while we need to continue identifying new sources of capital and new instruments, new innovative techniques, we first also need to ensure that the existing players who are dealing with SMEs are able to do it much better and efficiently. Similarly, investment funds, royalty finance instruments, convertible loans, mezzanine, as I talked about previously, are very, very critical for unlocking capital for SMEs. We don't know, and there aren't very many players who are actually coming up with these kinds of innovation in the market and offering them on a large scale basis. We also need to establish a venture capital industry and private equity industry, and some of the players who have started recently have been able to do a very small number of transactions. And we also saw press for some of the startups in Pakistan raising capital from the global community. But unless we're able to mobilize our domestic capital for impact and innovation, we'll continue to face lots of issues because reliance on foreign capital, while good, it brings in foreign capital into the country. We also need to look at whether it's coming in the form of equity or debt, and what kind of issues it creates as far as FX is concerned and FX rate is concerned, and also the IP, which continues to flow out of the country if foreign investors are putting money. Most of the time, they require startups domiciled outside. We need to keep a fairly liberal kind of policy in attracting foreign capital and let that capital come in. I'm not saying that that capital is not important. It's very, very important. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that we balance by ensuring that we're able to mobilize our domestic capital. Our domestic investors are very happy and comfy putting money in unproductive assets. When you talk about real estate, they're very happy putting money in real estate and earn rent. Everyone's a rent seeker. They like rent because it's stable, it's consistent. They're able to sell their assets when they want. There's liquidity in the secondary market. So they can plan their exits, they can plan their income streams, and they can plan their life around those income streams. When it comes to investing in fast growth SMEs, first of all, it's very illiquid, right? You get stuck, you don't know when to exit, where to exit. And then there are other challenges, SMEs, there's no organized platform, which is creating a pipeline of investable SMEs, which have been due diligence on behalf of investors who may or may not have the expertise to carry out that due diligence themselves. So those things have to be organized. And in case of SMEs, then we also need to recalibrate return expectation. We can't invest in SMEs only purely on the risk return framework. We also need to look at the liquidity, risk return, liquidity, and impact framework is the complete framework for evaluating. And we need to make the investors domestically aware of that framework and how they're able to, cope with the challenges vis-a-vis liquidity and risk related to this new asset class. There are other channels and other approaches I've evaluated perhaps, but the most promising approaches, the 5 top approaches, we'll perhaps keep the focus of our discussion on those today. I've also ranked the scalability and viability of the 10 solutions by the following criteria, by the demonstrations of viability, as well as the research criteria, which ability to, whether they have the ability to serve the SMEs, whether they possess central features, whether the model possesses nimbleness, improvement of risk management and operational efficiencies, as a modified approach to collateral, and 4 digital front or back-end components. So these are some things that I've evaluated in each one of the approaches. And viability, we have looked at 3 levels, whether strategic, operational, or financial level. So some of these schemes, according to this matrix, have been evaluated and then ranked accordingly into the next sections. Those that were not selected, I'm going to skip on that. Those that were selected include commercial bank with an SME unit, investment fund providing mezzanine, or perhaps other innovative instruments that we talked about, asset-backed financing to be encouraged more, flexible debt instruments, variable payment obligations, and tailored private equity and venture capital funds are critical for unlocking capital for SMEs in Pakistan. Now, when I look at the entire spectrum of SMEs and our sweet spot and the entire universe of potential capital sources across different points in the life cycle journey of an SME, it will be important to first classify the potential SMEs that we are going for. And I've labeled them as gazelle, zebra, and chicken. So the gazelle category is the high growth intent, innovative business model, ambitious founder, often technology focused, asset light, line of sight to an exit very close. Zebra category, on the other hand, is the moderate growth, often in bread and butter industries, strong founder, but often not seeking exit. And finally, chicken, lifestyle businesses and limited scale potential. These are some instruments, term sheets that I've developed for each one of those 5 promising approaches that perhaps we can discuss during the Q&A session in the end. Promising approach 1, commercial bank with an SME unit. Impact, if approached, is scaled. SMEs will become part of the mainstream financial sector, building a track record with commercial financial institutions, opening up other opportunities in financing, bring broader financial intermediation benefits to local economies like Pakistan, offer better access to payment systems, benefiting SMEs, the banks, and the broader economy. Probability for service provision over the full life cycle of business through SMEs becoming large businesses improving. So these are some impacts that we expect if approach is scaled. Challenges that must be overcome. There still needs to be a stronger demonstration of business case for the commercial banks. Most commercial banks are currently not too convinced. Some have ventured in SME and burned their hands. And those memories are still quite vivid in the minds of other managers who are running the SME units in other banks. These banks are also very comfortable investing in government securities where they get risk-free returns offered by government debt instruments. And when you look at the risk return trade-off of going into SMEs, which holds significantly higher level of risk, but returns currently which are not perhaps in line with the kind of risk returns that government is offering them, often these commercial banks are crowded out and they're not able to back SME. So the government also needs to make a policy, decision whether the insatiable appetite to finance their mega projects or letting the markets support SME sector, which is vital to strengthening our economy. Infrastructure is very important. Mega projects, I'm not saying are not important, but there needs to be a clear balance because SMEs are the essential engine for growth. This is a sector that will generate the future jobs, not the MNCs, right? And even if you create a housing program that will support several industries indirectly, but if we can start supporting industries directly, that will be much better and more impactful. We need to improve our build capacity in the country to improve the income levels, to kickstart the wealth generation engines in many districts and communities where the wealth generation engines are not functional, even though those districts and communities have many endowments and resources that can be harnessed to produce wealth for those local communities and for the country by creating integrated value chains. And we'll perhaps talk about a few examples how we can achieve that. The investment fund, if the impact that we can get if approach is scaled, it meets the needs of the enterprises, particularly as they grow, prepare stage. Risk capital is critical before credit can open up. And if we can bring in more risk capital in the country, ultimately we'll also create a direct impact in increasing the amount of credit that's flowing to them. Naturally, because most of those entities that previously were not eligible for credit will become eligible with a more risk capital flowing in them. Commercial banks could invest in and acquire these non-bank financial institutions also, which are providing risk capital, or perhaps, in lots of cases around the world, we've seen commercial banks having funds, private equity arms, providing non-financial support to those SMEs and startups. Essentially, they take an ecosystem approach as opposed to just going out in the market, identifying credit opportunities. They create those opportunities by giving non-financial support, by bringing in risk capital, and then ultimately unlocking their credit books for supporting growth and listing those companies ultimately on exchanges. Also, in those developed countries, you see exchanges at different levels operating from small exchange to small caps to mid caps to large caps, where there's a significant amount of liquidity for these investors to exit. In Pakistan, these exit opportunities and exchanges, lack of exchanges at the medium to low end have also hampered attracting our investors. We have seen SME board that was established many years back, but we haven't seen a single transaction on that board. And recently, there's been some reform and GEM board has been established, but still we've yet to see a transaction on GEM board. And I've also given a proposal to SME, SECP to perhaps also create a small cap which serves as a jumping pad, a launch pad for creating a pipeline of opportunities. And those startups which are not currently meeting the listing criteria for GEM, investors can perhaps create active trading market on small cap exchange. So some of these things perhaps can yield results, but again, these are experiments, and we need to dig deeper and think deeper and collect more evidence and continue to fine tune these models as we are testing them in the market. Asset-backed financing is happening, but not at scale. We also need to encourage asset-backed financing for the startup segment. We also need to create, working capital facilities, syndicated facilities. Perhaps on a program-based basis, we can create a number of different instruments that can be unleashed to startups, and the portfolio can be insured at the bottom end of the spectrum. You can create a classic securitization waterfall, senior secured debt, senior debt, and then we can have first loss, or we can create even Class C shareholding where we can bring in capital that can de-risk the commercial capital, or perhaps offer credit guarantees somehow that can improve the ratings of the senior and secured debt out there. So these are some innovative structuring and securitizations that we need to do to be able to unlock more credit and asset-backed financing available to startups. It's happening, but not at scale. And more players, current incumbent players, financial institutions who have the mandate to do exactly this, need to be pushed in this direction. Impact, if approaches scale, we can standardize asset-backed financing as a specific product, particularly if it is applied by sector. It can lend itself to volume underwriting. We can have program-based lending schemes, and that can achieve scale very easily. And there are many successful examples of these globally. Challenges that you must overcome. We need to choose sectors and verticals carefully. Where we need to go and how we need to, because for each sector and for each vertical, we need to have a dedicated strategy and a select set of partners who are providing a whole host of support services alongside. the services and offered by the financing or leasing institution. Market risks are fairly complicated for the residual asset valuation. So those things, one has to also do some TA, technical assistantship for the financial institutions that we are encouraging to roll out these innovative instruments. Flexible debt instrument I've talked about previously also, variable payment obligation is the key innovation that I believe perhaps our financial institutions need to come up with. It's a matter of structuring and a matter of being able to lend on a cash flow basis as opposed to the collateral based lending mindset that typically our commercial banks have. And once you take a cash flow based lending approach and you're able to build that capacity and you're able to evaluate, project the cash flows, value the risk of the project of the SME, and then create an instrument that works with the SME. So when the SME has cash, they can pay, and when they don't have cash, you can give them a breathing space. You work with the client and you help strengthen your client. And as you strengthen your client, you strengthen your own balance sheet and your own organization. A bank is only as strong as its clients. So if you give rigid payment schedules and those in, SMEs or borrowers who are not able to pay back, you put them in the default category. Ultimately, once you underwrite and you basically have to close the book. So there's no recovery after that point. You have to book your loss and move on. But if you continue to work with your clients and borrowers, ultimately what matters is that you're able to identify those who are willing to be successful and willing to work with you to continue to achieve success. And as long as you are able to differentiate between the willful and the unwillful defaulters and take this approach of continue to work with your client to ensure that he's able to become strong ultimately and help you strengthen your income sources and your organization, it is a win-win situation for everyone. So impact, if approach is scaled, it meets the needs of the investee as there's more flexibility of how to pay back, and the entrepreneurs are not forced to give up equity prematurely. And entrepreneurs understand the product potential for sustainable delivery of business development services. There's liquidity mechanism built in, so it promises a return for capital for investors, providing a longer-term capital source for entrepreneurs. There are multiple applications per funder type. Could be microfinance institution, could be regulated bank, small foundation, individual, or perhaps even fintechs can come and get into this space. Challenges: the solution is still early stage, so current solutions that are underway must demonstrate and solutions which are being deployed in this category. This is an innovation at the global front. So you will see few countries which have tested this model, and almost all of them have been very successful in delivering impact. The case of Nicaragua is very strong, where similar in my previous organization, we were tasked by one of the donors to actually develop this instrument. We developed this instrument, and our organization won the Global Innovation Award as far as financial instruments for startups and SMEs was concerned. So, and I can have a dedicated session just on this one product and the learnings of our deployment of this product in Nicaragua. The tailored private equity fund, and I'll talk a bit about that in detail. Private equity in Pakistan, even though there have been some initiatives in the past, for example, USAID supported 3 private equity funds under the private investment initiatives, and some new venture capital funds have started. But most of them lack rigor and experience to deal with this relatively new asset class. This is not just a passive fund where you invest and do portfolio management for your investors. Companies that you screen, that you filter, that you invest in there has to be a lot of rigor in identifying and finding investable opportunities, but not just there, but also once you have invested in a portfolio, you need to assign portfolio managers and go into those companies, wear a consultant hat and create value in those companies, improve their systems and processes and help them accelerate, boost their networks, connect them to sources of capital, and just handhold them through the acceleration stage and ultimately find exit opportunities so that you can realize returns for investors who have supported them through this acceleration phase. So all of that requires a dedicated team on ground, which has experience working with young enterprises, creating enterprises, taking them to scale and exiting them. Identifying founders who have the experience to combine and matchmake with these companies, because most often than not, companies are formed, they have the right ideas, they have the right technologies, but they don't have the right leadership. and creating dedicated founder program where you match make the right founders who have the ability to take perhaps any company to scale, but finding the right idea first and then finding the right founder, matchmaking them perhaps is a better approach. So this is something I'll talk about in my annex as we conclude this presentation in the end. Since we're running short of time, I'd like to now skip through the last few promising approaches, emerging themes. It is important to note that we need a combination of approaches delivered by a variety of factors to meet needs of our target market. There is no single approach or solution that alone will achieve the stretch goal of an increased scale and reach of investment capital for SMEs in Pakistan. Additionally, a variety of capital types, debt, equity, mezzanine, is required to support the building blocks of the SME balance sheet. Across all of these approaches, three themes emerge to enhance the efficacy of solution: the critical need for well-structured subsidies or concessional capital for these approaches to be viable, youth entrepreneurship and Kamyab Jawan or the previous Prime Minister Youth Loan Scheme, have had dismal performance. Why? Because the subsidies and the concessional programs have not been thought through, have not been backed by evidence of what are the needs of those that you are going after, and the intermediaries through which you want to disperse. What are their motivations, right? I mean, unless you align all of these things together, just creating a thoughtless subsidy program is not going to yield a desired result. So the initial, since I was the secretary of the Kamyab Jawan, Prime Minister's Kamyab Jawan team, the blueprint I gave to the PM's office that was led by Mr. Usman Dar, they could only absorb only a small segment of the entire blueprint, and then they went out and pushed that. And despite my trying to convince them over a year and a half to do this in a more exhaustive and a complete basis, now they are turning around and trying to do the kind of things I had asked them to work with SME Credit Guarantee Company and other things. So let's see what the results are. But we have wasted quite a lot of time, and this time could have been utilized very effectively if the right structures and if these concessions and subsidy programs were designed on an evidence-backed, on a need-backed basis. The primacy of business development services is very critical. You can't just ask banks to start lending and launch a political program and expect everyone will join the program and all banks will start opening their credit books. The borrowers, entities who demand that capital, you need to first create that demand. You need to bring in rigorous incubation, acceleration, business development support services to create a pipeline of companies that demand that capital. In all my studies done at the state bank level in the last decade, and there are quite a lot of them, I've gone and evaluated all major banks in the country, and I've realized that issue is not that of capital. We're flush with local liquidity, but that local liquidity is going after wrong. The priorities are not very clear. Pakistan remains a classic case of misplaced priorities. While we talk about youth and the importance of youth, while we talk about agriculture and agri-backed economy and the importance of agriculture sector, when we look at the quantum of capital going into SMEs and agriculture and startups, it's very disappointing. So we need to prepare. We need to prepare agri-businesses. We need to make them bankable, investable. We need to prepare SMEs. We need to prepare startups. We need to make them bankable and investable. And that's why dedicated business development services need to be. And then advent of technology as a potential catapult to scale is critical. Without technology solving almost every need out there in the market. And there's a lot of technology available out there in the market, but organized thinking of how to bring all of these things together into organized programs. I recently designed a program, Prime Minister's Billion Tree Honey, in which I've tried to bring all of these little aspects in creating a viable model for accelerating beekeepers, SMEs involved in this apiculture space, banks which want to lend to agriculture sector in a sustainable manner, and other stakeholders, investors who want to come invest in various initiatives and opportunities that will be emerging as we scale up this sector. For example, putting up processing units, which kind of get honey and honey byproducts export ready and then export into the international markets. There's a huge international market, and honey is a premium product with premium price in the market, local and international. And honey is just one of the 9 byproducts. There are 9 other byproducts which sell at almost 10, 20, even sometimes higher than that price of honey. So if honey sells about 4,000 a kg in the market, royal jelly, for example, sells at a multiple quantum of that price in the market. more than 60, 70, even 80,000. You won't find royal jelly in Pakistan. In Europe, if you go, it even goes beyond 2 lakh certified. So, and and there are many other byproducts that come out of apiculture, and the unit economics of one hive and one small apiary managed by a small SME is very strong, not only in terms of the returns it generates, but also in terms of the impact it generates, in terms of the pollination and the impact in environment, in terms of how the wealth is trickling down to the bottom of the pyramid, enabling the poor families. And the business model innovation that we brought into the Prime Minister's Billion Tree, is also very critical. Perhaps if in the Q&A we have time, we'll talk about that. I think we've gone a bit over time, and I'm still not done with my entire presentation. So I would like to just kind of perhaps move towards the required shift in approach at both the transaction and systematic level. We need an honest dialogue that is grounded in real data, with commitment by all actors to sharing of investment data and financial and non-financial, both to inform and to guide capital allocations and to establish an impact benchmark. Proactive efforts to activate local investors and thereby domestic capital markets as the only and the most sustainable way to mitigate foreign exchange risk. Efforts to solve for the foreign exchange fluctuation in emerging markets through stimulating the domestic capital markets. Transaction level and operational level, more and better targeted use of blended finance instruments that can be introduced. And we'll talk about a few blended finance instruments and financing facilities aggregated for State Bank and for others in the last few years in Pakistan, how they can be utilized. Required shift in approach, justification for subsidy, lowering the barriers at both levels, transaction, operational, systematic, will require not only thoughtful, well-designed interventions, coordinating among many actors, but will also need targeted subsidization through the use of grant and or concessional capital support. Grant support is material, not marginal, to address these barriers and create necessary enabling environment for financing SMEs in Pakistan. Many of the causes for the high cost per transaction and the depression of returns arise from the deficiency or inefficiencies in the broader environment. For example, difficulty in recruiting qualified staff is something that needs to be looked at. Recognizing the importance of subsidy, we believe it is vital to sharpen its use case. And we've talked about it already, so I'm going to skip this detail. Justification of subsidy, the primary focus of subsidy, the level of subsidy, the recipient of subsidy, the target use of subsidy, target benefits of subsidy. I've done a bit of analysis on where perhaps the subsidy can be used much better. But certainly the way subsidy is currently being used, it's not optimal, and we need to have a deeper thinking on how these subsidies can be better utilized, because capital is scarce at the government's end. So overall, the split that I see where we can unlock capital, and we can go into Q&A and we can talk a bit more about it. The donors, the DFIs, the diaspora have to play a major role, but then corporates who have remained silent, we need to also now reach out to them. And most of the SMEs are typically a part of an SME part of a value chain or supply chain of a larger corporate. And this is not really CSR for them, this is business for them. And creating models which are inclusive, ultimately, these are the new models of business which will be sustainable and scalable for corporates. And we can perhaps look at the case of apiculture program that we're doing, and the company that's basically providing buyback arrangements to all the beekeepers and giving them equity vesting over a period of time. So how we can create these inclusive business models so that we let our actors who are lower down in the supply chain to also participate in the wealth at the high end of the value chain by giving them some equity vesting rights. Call to action, action framework for capital providers, collective action initiatives, promising solutions. We need to embrace strategic and systematic action framework as anchored in 3 dimensions of capital providers funding. Number 2, a variety of promising solutions enabled through collective action. Before we dive into the recommended actions, we want to re-emphasize several key messages that are critical for the suggested promising approaches. Moving from diffuse and fragmented transactional to more strategic, smart, and systematic investment is critical. Focusing on real economy SMEs is very important. Those that produce tangible goods and services that meet people's real needs, accepting that basic business may not be sexy, but it's solid. So we need to have a clear view on the 3 categories that defined previously, the gazelle, the zebra, and the chicken, and have proper allocation in each one of those segments. Having an honest dialogue that's grounded in real data, not hyperbolic dialogue that underestimates the challenges and masks the potential solutions. Recalibrating the return expectations, we've talked about that. We need to look at the whole risk return, liquidity, and impact framework as opposed to just the risk return framework while attracting investors. We also need to look at what returns other asset classes are offering and the kind of returns offered by SMEs in emerging markets, and whatever data we have available for Pakistan also. And complement that perhaps with essentially what kind of impact we expect to generate by going after that SME segment, and what kind of patriotic discount or impact discount those investors are willing to. So the total return, that is a combination of financial return and impact return, needs to be looked at here as opposed to just the financial return. So the 4 calls to action: building a data set, focusing on one sector at a time, not country. One sector as a community of factors, like creating funds for agriculture, clean energy, unlocking domestic capital markets as the only viable solution to foreign exchange issues, and building the local talent pool. We can go into details of all these. We have some the surveys that I've carried out. I've summarized them, and the data will be available in my report as I complete it. But generally, the overall desk research, own experience in surveys and interviews of key stakeholders. A developed financial ecosystem is important to assist raising the necessary quantum of capital. Focus on small and growing small businesses is valuable, but increase industry focus on SMEs is required to reach the scale. This is very critical. High transaction costs and friction in raising capital leads to delays in funding and delays in creating new institutions. Economy is nothing but a bag of transactions. And if we can increase the pace of transaction and the pace at which we're executing transaction and get actors on both sides of the transaction ready and align their expectations and recalibrate their return expectations, I think we can play a role in improving the number of transactions and essentially growing our economy, and ultimately opening up business development services to provide important assistance and catalyze success in lending. There are distinct supply side constraints to raising capital for SME finance. In the country, regulatory requirement, commercial banks and investors are acting rationally these days. I feel they're looking to go after this new segment, but we need to show them the way, and we need to work with them to come up with some innovations and leverage the existing technology to enable them. There's sufficient amounts of soft capital available to mitigate and underwrite risk from development finance institutions. We need to create blended finance facilities. I've created one such securitization waterfall under a Pakistan Innovation Fund. On the request of Ministry of Science and Technology, I structured this facility, and ultimately then the ministry did not push it, but I worked with Ministry of Finance through the section officer, and I had it announced in the last budget speech by Minister Mahmoud Azhar, even though most of the ministers did not know that it was being announced. But after that, there was no owner of this fund. Ultimately, this STZA was formed, the Special Technology Zone Authority, and I'm now looking to take this entire structure under that authority and helping them establish this fund so that we can bring in some commercial capital and aggregate that demand from our industry and investors at the fund level. This fund is not going to go out and invest in the market directly, but work with existing funds through a co-investment window, and then also create a direct investment window in which it will provide exit to the pre-IPO stage companies that it had previously invested in. That's the high-level structure, Innovation Fund. I'll pause here, and I'll now, perhaps we can start the Q&A, and we can focus our Q&A. The work we're doing in HSC, if you look at the bottom left spectrum, this creates a supply of technologies and startups. And this Innovation Fund, the way I've designed this entire fund, it aggregates the demand. To create a viable market, we have to take a demand supply approach, and just throwing grants, increasing the supply of research, increasing the supply of technologies and startups is not just going to deliver impact unless we're able to identify the demand on the other side, ensure that whatever innovation is happening, research is happening, startups are being created, are demand driven, so that we don't start searching for demand after we create that supply, and ultimately aggregate that demand so that we're able to execute transactions more efficiently and achieve scale. So having said that, sir, sorry I took a bit long, and I'll open myself to now any question and answers from the audience, from yourself, if there may be any questions.
Thank you, Umar. I think that is very interesting, very good talk. Can I just ask everybody to raise their hands as if you want to ask a question, we'll certainly get to you. But before I go to the audience, Umar, can I ask you very simply? I know there is a huge romance about SMEs, but I've never really understood what an SME is. When I look at Engro, for example, which is one of the largest companies that we have, it's only $1 billion of market cap or whatever of value. To my mind, in the international parlance, that's probably an SME too. So in Pakistan's context, what is an SME? Can you please define it for us? And as you said, of course, it's a large and diverse sector. But within that, you've targeted like, I think, 500 to a million or something, 500,000 to a million. Is that good size SME or a small or a big SME? Or what? So, I mean, I'm trying to understand the whole SME concept.
So there are a couple of definitions, Dr. Nadeem. IFC has its definition, State Bank has its definition, SMEDA has its definition. SMEDA and State Bank are now aligned in their definition, but you can stratify the SME universe by employees, by revenue, by assets, by a whole host of different indicators. Generally, we feel that SMEs, the small category, is something that microfinance industry is just touching, because micro enterprises, grow to a certain scale, and there are caps on the amount of lending microfinance institutions can do. So they're only able to barely touch the small category of it. Now, how you define whether a small enterprise is defined by an enterprise which has employees less than 5 or less than 10, that's a secondary discussion. And you can use any one of the three definitions that I talked about. They're very close. There's not a whole lot of difference. But ultimately, what we want to see is that who's catering to them. When we talk about the category that where microfinance cannot venture, and where there's no commercial case for the larger commercial banks, that is what we call the missing middle. And that is a segment that I believe is almost about 40% of our economy that continues to be ignored, where the commercial banks can't venture. And I'm not covering the informal sector yet. Informal sector obviously is informal, right? So that needs to be formalized. I'm talking about the formal sector. So that's about 40% of our SME that remains ignored. But yes, you're right. In the medium category, when you talk about the medium end of it, especially the larger medium enterprises, they will be covered by corporates and likes of Engros, which have graduated now, gone beyond the medium scale. These are large enterprises. They're well catered for. The banks, and others, private equity players locally and globally are working with them. The IFCs, the CDCs, they're all flirting with them, right? And so they have many options available. But the missing middle is my focus in this entire research, who no one is talking to, no one has the mandate for, and there are restrictions on micro and commercial banks to deal with them. So what do we do for them? Because that is the real growth for engine. And I can give an example of apiculture sector and what we have done there, and how we intend on creating a pipeline of companies which are bankable, and ultimately creating the scale that will make the existing players provide more capital. But perhaps there's also a case of creating a new regulatory framework under State Bank for SME banks, like we did for microfinance banks, where you essentially give them relaxed paid up capital requirement as opposed to commercial banks, where you give them less leeway to play in the markets and do things that otherwise commercial banks can do. But at the same time, they can perhaps go out and experiment a bit more with their capital than what we have allowed our microfinance banks to do. And there are cases in other countries where such regulatory frameworks for the SME banks have been created. We also have an SME bank that we wanted to, I wrote a concept note for State Bank about 7 years back. And after that, the whole privatization process started around SME bank, but we have gone nowhere. And we could have created one role model SME bank and then created this regulatory framework around that role model SME bank. In SME banking, we need to leverage a lot of technology and fintech and innovate alternate delivery channels, because the cost of building brick and mortar branches doesn't make sense. It doesn't give the ROI to the shareholders, right? So, I mean, I've gone a bit long in response to your question, but I hope I have defined my target market for this research a bit more. Yeah.
Umar sahab, फिर भी मुझे समझ नहीं आ रही कि a lot of this work has been done for the State Bank, as you said.
जी. मैंने ये 10 साल जो काम किया स्टेट बैंक के लिए किया, ये उसकी रिसर्च की बेसिस पे अब मैं ये काम खुद कर रहा हूँ। इस वक्त मुझे कोई स्पॉन्सर नहीं कर रहा। मेरे पिछले 3 साल में जितने भी काम हुए हैं उसमें से कुछ स्टडीज HSC के प्लेटफॉर्म पे कर रहा हूँ, बट बाय एंड लार्ज मेजॉरिटी ऑफ देम आई एम डूइंग इट ऑन माय ओन। देयर इज नो वन स्पॉन्सरिंग मी।
Good job, good job. No, the question that I had was कि State Bank and SMEs. State Bank की fund अभी law नहीं लिख रहा है, पहले भी लिख चुका है, and we are trying to get the State Bank independence. I'm a bit surprised. What has the State Bank got to do with SMEs? A. Second, the approach that you're taking and the State Bank is taking as well, that SMEs, the biggest constraint to SMEs is capital. Would you agree that, I'm half you here at PIDE, and I have done some work on this too, that capital is not the constraint to SMEs. I know the World Bank likes to think capital is a constraint because the World Bank obviously is a lending agency. ADB is a lending agency. Their DNA is the capital as a constraint. We've just done something, maybe SMEs, maybe not, but maybe micro. But we've just done a project for setting up street vending in Islamabad. You probably heard of it. It's in G11, G10, or whatever you're doing.
That's a fantastic initiative. Yes.
But the question is, when we've done a survey on them, and we find they really don't need credit. For them, the bigger problem is regulation. So how do you see this? Where does the need for credit begin? And where does the need for regulation begin? Because to my mind, the biggest problem right now, I mean, not to my mind, to our research, the biggest problem is regulation, not SME, not credit. Would you agree with that?
So in my presentation, I actually already responded to this question, and I'm in total agreement with you, Dr. Nadeem. Credit is the last thing. And because we don't have the clarity of what is required to take that company to a point where they ultimately need that credit, and we continue to bring credit before everything else that needs to come before credit, this model is not working. So the business development support that we need to give to these companies, the risk capital that these companies need, the smart capital that these perhaps companies need to improve the governance, to improve the systems, to improve the processes, the acceleration support that these SMEs need, perhaps cluster associations need to be created to, give them services on a shared basis. A lot of things need to be done with these SMEs before. So we need to scale their revenue. We need to scale their size before they become interesting enough for the banks, where then credit needs to be opened up for them, and where they actually need credit. And ultimately, you see, there has to be a complete journey for this SME. Where are we trying to take this SME ultimately? And I segmented my entire SME universe into 3 categories: the gazelle, the zebra, and the chicken. Gazelle, for example, I would like to see these companies in 3 to 5 years being listed on GEM board. In Pakistan's history, in 70, 80 years, we've not created a single unicorn in our ecosystem. Every company that needs to become a unicorn has to leave Pakistan. Unfortunate, right? I mean, all these foreign investors see that opportunity, they invest in it, they want them to have holdcos outside Pakistan, so they have to leave outside Pakistan. So we need to create an ecosystem that handholds these companies and ultimately lists them on our exchange and creates our own unicorns. We've started now seeing some activity in startups, and hopefully we can carry on this momentum and just organize our ecosystem and have a more thought through strategy, not 100% reliance on credit, which is happening currently and which is a totally flawed strategy. So I totally agree with you.
But there's another issue that I want to raise with you, then I'll quickly go to the floor. I'm taking up too much space. There is a romance now with startups. Well, Pakistan is a startup country, and we are 70 years later, we are still a startup country. And maybe 1,000 years later, we'll still be there. I mean, somehow we don't get to scale Pakistan. Forget about the SME. We are not scaling Pakistan. Pakistan is stuck as a micro enterprise, not even a SME yet. We are still in the low income developing country category. So we are really, so talk of unicorn kind of scares me, because we have not been able to make Pakistan a unicorn. We haven't come out of the low income developing country. But I'd like to draw your attention to something. Let's take Sialkot, for example. Or let's take Wazirabad or Gujarat, sorry. whatever. I mean, these cities have industry which is really, as far as I can see, small and medium enterprise. Salcott, we checked recently, has over 1,000 sports manufacturing outfits or surgical goods outfits. Now, what would you suggest for some of these that are really small enterprises? Why are they still small enterprises? After 4 generations, Salcott is still full of SMEs. Gujarat, after 4 or 5 generations, is still full of SMEs. Is it that they lack credit? What is it? Why are they not growing?
So amongst the list of things that I mentioned earlier on that are critical before we start focusing on credit, essentially creating clusters of in
Salcott has clusters.
Yes, Salcott is a cluster and has built up upon clusters, and we need to replicate similar clusters across different cities, understanding the local capabilities and endowments, and that is a starting point for. I 100% agree. This is the way forward. So
no, but what is the reason that the cluster in Salcott has not succeeded in 4 generations? There is, forget unicorn, there is not even a single Salcott firm listed on the Pakistan Stock Exchange, and not a single Salcott firm that has reached $1 billion mark.
I'll give you an example, just one small example, and focus on Salcott that will explain the point. So Salcott, for example, medical instruments, they're known for that, and they're known for other clusters also, but medical instruments is one. By the way, जितने भी लोग Salcott में business चला रहे हैं, यूनिवर्सिटी से पढ़ के नहीं आए, इनको यूनिवर्सिटीज ने कुछ ज़्यादा सपोर्ट नहीं दिया आज तक, हाँ? और जितना इन्होंने किया अपने बलबूते पे किया, और very entrepreneurial in nature, very lot of dynamism in that community. But एक मैं instrument का example दूंगा यहाँ पे. For example, Lagrangoscope. Lagrangoscope is a small instrument that is being manufactured in Salcott at a very small cost, and maybe $20-25. They sell it to Germany, and Germany basically adds a small IoT devices, puts a stamp, and then sells the same instrument at about over $400 globally, and back to us also. हम ही उनको वो चीज है, हमारी बहुत सी यूनिवर्सिटीज मिलके इन चीजों के साथ इनोवेशन, उन कंपनीज को, इन एसएमईज को, क्लस्टर्स को थोड़ा सा इनोवेशन इसमें लाई जाए, दुनिया की इस वक्त रीजनल एंड ग्लोबल डिमांड को समझा जाए कि what are the emerging technologies, what is the next step change in that industry. अगर वो इनोवेशन एंड बेस्ट प्रैक्टिसेस एंड नॉलेज और इनोवेशन को नहीं मिलती और वो अपनी पूरी दुनिया की जो इनोवेशन हो रही है उसके साथ एट पेस नहीं रहते तो वो पीछे रह जाएंगे. और ओवर द इयर्स यही हुआ, उनकी डायनामिज्म तो थी, क्लस्टर्स तो बन गए, काम शुरू कर दिया, एक लेबर एडवांटेज थी हमारे पास, काम भी शुरू कर दिया, एट लो कॉस्ट बना के बेचना भी शुरू कर दिया. बट बियॉन्ड दैट वो जो पिछली जनरेशन थी, एंड आई फील कि हमारे मुल्क में एक और बड़ी एक प्रॉब्लम है कि हम यूथ को आगे नहीं आने देते. तो फैमिलीज में भी ये होता है, इंस्टीट्यूशन में भी ये होता है, एंड द ओल्डर जनरेशन हैज अ बिट ऑफ एन इनर्शिया टू अडॉप्ट न्यू इनोवेशंस. And when they leave, they kind of take the vision with them. One generation makes money, the other generation destroys that money, and we've seen that happen so many times. We are not able to institutionalize our businesses. So, and there are other challenges, and we can dissect and bisect all these challenges. But point ये है कि ये किसी एक इदारे का काम नहीं है, इसको मिलके करने वाला काम है. And हमें पहले तो starting point for everything is data, as I pointed out in my call for action. So this collective call for action, we need to, and it's high time we need to create a forum, and perhaps PIDE could be that forum. And I'm happy to continue feeding my research done in this space so far. And then with the guidance of esteemed economists like yourself and others who are interested in this space, we may take a wrong direction, but ultimately, if the ultimate purpose is there, we will find our course and we'll find the right solution.
Great, thank you. Let me go to the floor. Mansoor Saab.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Ji, we can hear you. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Mansoor Sani. I am currently working at FPCCI, and I have just started working there. I was a part of PIDE during my studies in MPhil. अच्छा, मेरे दो सवाल हैं. एक तो यह है कि जो मेरा छोटा सा एनालिसिस है जिसकी बेसिस पे मेरा ये सवाल है कि डोंट यू थिंक कि हमारा इशू जो है वो लैक ऑफ कॉन्फिडेंस है. आज का हमारा जो इन्वेस्टर है वो ज्यादा डरा हुआ है. he is more threatened from the risk के मेरा जो instability है इकोनॉमी में, उसकी वजह से जो मेरा इन्वेस्टमेंट है या जो मेरा स्टार्टअप है वो डूब जाएगा। इस वजह से भी एसएमईज में जो है वो ग्रोथ नहीं हो रही है। इसके ऊपर थोड़ा सा आप मुझे एक तो बता दें। दूसरा ये है कि इज देयर एनी पॉसिबिलिटी कि हम गवर्नमेंट को अगर इस सिस्टम से बाहर निकाल दें कि इन्वेस्टर खुद जो है वो स्टार्टअप जो करना चाहता है ये दोनों खुद हो जाएं, तो बीच में से जो एक गवर्नमेंट की हमारे यहाँ जो एक बेहतर तस्वीर नहीं है, उसकी वजह से भी शायद ये इशू आ रहा है कि एसएमईज स्टार्टअप नहीं हो रहे। तो अगर हम गवर्नमेंट को निकाल दें और जो इन्वेस्टमेंट करने वाला है वो खुद जो है स्टार्टअप करने वाले से अगर मीट करता है, कोई ऐसा सिस्टम, कोई पॉलिसी बनी है या इसके ऊपर कुछ थॉट्स हैं, तो ये दो चीजें जरा क्लेरिफाई कर दीजिएगा।
हमारे साहब बताइए।
जी जी, मैं तो मेरा आई एम देखें जी, माय फोकस ऑल माय लाइफ हैज बीन आई एम अ कैपिटल मार्केट एक्सपर्ट. Before I came back to Pakistan in 2011, I spent good 7-8 years working on Wall Street, and at the risk of perhaps boasting my own trumpet here, we were at the forefront of innovation on Wall Street. Some of the instruments I designed and structured for some of the leading investment banks in US perhaps उस तरह के instruments अब दुनिया नहीं बना पाएगी, because 2008 में पूरा world financial crisis आया. And all my life, I focused on capital markets and capital market investors. But when I came to Pakistan, I realized the mindset of our investors is also a major challenge. And sometimes we need to address the market failures that I talked about in my presentation. This rent-seeking mindset and this inability to understand new innovation and new economy opportunities is something that we also need to tackle. So I do not believe in public funding, and I do not believe in public spending to produce commercial activities, to support commercial activities. At the same time, subsidies are important to understand the demand side issues and to address the supply side issues where commercial capital cannot come. Generally, we need to initiate with some subsidy program, but those subsidy programs need to be a bit thought out. But today's session was not about subsidies, what we need from the government. Today's session, the entire session was, what are the different commercial actors and what are the different commercial instruments for finance that we need to identify so that we are able to meet the demand supply gaps of SMEs. And perhaps there is some role for the government in bringing some subsidy and some grant money here. But by and large, the 3 billion amount that I've estimated that we can unlock for SMEs is not coming from the government, it's coming from commercial investors. So I agree with you. We need to kind of differentiate between the role of government and the role of private investors.
Thank you. Zishan Tareen.
While we wait for the next hand, I'd like to share a screen, a video, a short video, 2-minute video on a platform I created for SCCP to connect our private investors with our SMEs and fast growth opportunities. So can you hear the sound?
No. How about it?
So this platform went live in Feb. Since Feb, I received about over 600 plus applications from startups around Pakistan without doing any marketing. That shows the appetite for capital. These companies are naturally looking to raise capital. They have ideas. We screened those. Majority of those we felt were not mature enough, and they perhaps had to go through some incubation program before they could connect with us. But we picked up a portfolio of about 100 startups. And out of those 100 startups, we did some due diligence on the, looked at their valuations, business plans, and we created a portfolio of almost about 20-25 companies. This is the portfolio of our companies. I've created a complete securitization model, which I wanted to quickly show you. So what I've done is basically we've gone and done an in-depth due diligence on this portfolio, about 30 companies, projected their cash flows, looked at their repayment capacities, identified what is their optimal capital strategy, how much debt, if there's debt capacity, repayment capacity, and then the remaining amount through other instruments, perhaps if they can do equity or convertibles without diluting. The core objective is that we need to minimize the dilution and ultimately ensure that they have capital across the entire life cycle journey of that company till we accelerate and list that company on the exchange. So keeping that in mind, we create the capital strategy and then the instruments that we need to and finalize those term sheets. And based on the instruments that the fund will invest in, then the fund will start earning some cash flow. Based on the debt instruments, we'll earn some interest, and then ultimately we get the payment principal back. And based on the equity, we get some dividend payments. So ultimately, in the case of startups, generally these are usually not profitable startups, but occasionally you would go into companies which are profitable and can pay you dividends also along the way. But we're not typically people, investors who come into startups don't come for dividends and regular profit taking. But what they do, the game is basically they come and invest in a certain multiple in 3 years, 5 years. They expect the multiple valuation multiple will go tenfold, and they'll be able to exit and make money out of that exit. So, so we take certain assumptions in best median case scenario, and we projected the portfolio returns on fairly conservative basis. And what we're able to create is an instrument which is diversified, in which investors, if they participate, they're able to take diversified exposure, not in one company, but across 30-35 solid companies that have been screened out of a much larger portfolio and which have gone through multiple filters before they invested it. So by diversifying in a fund, they're able to de-risk their investment immediately. Secondly, on a portfolio basis, we feel that if you have a small hit ratio of success stories, ultimately your entire portfolio will realize the return expectations that investors have. Individually, when investors go into startups, it's very difficult. So I just want to show that we have been working to mobilize domestic capital, and the work I'm doing with HSC, because in this new knowledge economy, the input to the replacement to raw material for industry as it was in the industrial age is now the knowledge worker, the IP. So unless we increase the quality and the supply of this research technology, on the other side, what I'm doing here, which is the demand side, if I don't get a quality pipeline, then I won't be able to attract the investors. So it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem. It's a difficult problem, and one has to work in tandem both on supply and demand side. So
let me get to the next question, please. Zishantareen. Zishantareen, please introduce yourself and ask. Zishan sir, we can't hear you.
My question.
Sir,
I have experience of almost a decade in SME lending in MCB Bank. The thing that I want to point out is here that SMEs suffocate because of the knowledge and the financing amount that is financed by the state bank. So, for example, if we look at the ADR ratios, advance to deposit, almost 9,000 billion and 400 billion out of 9,000 billion. There are 6 million SMEs, and the banks have financed only 1,78,000 SMEs only. So one thing is that we are not inclined to finance the SMEs to the level that they require. And the second thing is we do not have a single data center or a data scientist for SMEs who can, there's no single platform that addresses to the needs of SME at one time. For example, the SBP, SME banks, SMEDA, Chamber of Commerce, associations, SME players and banks, they are all working in isolation. Nobody has taken the initiative that who is being held responsible for the last 3-4 decades of poor performance of SME. We need to create a simple data center that is like NCOC that supervises everything. And I know of 100 of investors who have 100 to 200 million rupees of capital, but they could not invest because they do not have the confidence over these institutions or the policies. And the third thing, law and order situation. There is no guarantee their receivables, their stocks, and their all the agreements could be executed under Pakistan law. What we need to do is create a data center and centralize a consolidated approach. I have sent an email to Nadeem Saab if he kindly look at this. I'm thankful that someone is taking ownership of that.
Great, Zishan Saab, come and talk to us. We will certainly work with you. We're looking for people like you. Thank you. Umar Saab?
जी सर. So sorry, आपका नाम मैं भूल रहा हूँ. ये who was this?
Zishan sir. Zishan.
Zishan. So Zishan Saab, one of my call to action, you basically commented, you've endorsed that call to action, and I totally agree that we need to have a coordinated approach, and we need to, we need to make sure that we have relevant data to guide us in designing all our future interventions related to SME. And there's no one single data repository on SME, and there are many different institutions which are looking at the SME space within their mandate. SMEDA is doing it, SME Bank is doing it, State Bank is looking at it, has been looking at it. But coordination between these actors is, yes, missing. Recently, there was some SME council that was also established by the under the Ministry of Commerce. What they're doing, what they're not doing, I'm not privy to a large extent. SMEDA reached out to us at HSC, and I've given them a thought where we need to create a national idea lab, perhaps, where SMEs who are struggling with innovation and perhaps don't have that kind of formal education that will allow them to formalize their businesses and go through incubation, organize incubation acceleration programs, and then go through listing processes. On the other side, we have startups who are not grounded in practical reality, have led a very sheltered life. If we can create a matchmake between the right startups who have the right innovative ideas or technologies with SMEs, that can unleash tremendous opportunities for the startups because they're able to get connected with real economy. There's also a lot of infatuation on technology without having a sense of the real economy. I call it the high-tech myopia. Technology on its own doesn't produce well. It has to somehow enable real economy. So this linkage between SMEs and startups is something that we're pursuing under the National Idea Lab. But, I totally agree with you, and I'm available to support you.
Let me go to the next question. Alia Khan.
Ji, thank you, Nadeem. And thank you, Umar, for a very, very detailed presentation. I admire your energy for putting this whole framework in front of us. So my question is that there are SMEs that are beyond the realm of HEC. What do you have to say about those? Because as I see it, you are talking about the kind of entrepreneurial and innovative talent that comes out of universities and higher education institutions of all kinds. What about the manufacturing SMEs that, for example, Dr. Nadeem also alluded to, that are already there? What would be the uptake of the framework that you have presented to us be for those manufacturing SMEs? Yesterday, I heard Danny Roderick speaking on the role of the manufacturing sector, and that without elevating the role of the manufacturing sector, there can really be no economic growth, according to Danny Roderick, very famous economist. So I would like your take on that. Thank you.
So first of all, I'm just a consultant in HSC, and यहाँ पे मेरा जो mandate था ये startups को support करना था. So, and I felt that there's a lot of grant that has been given to HSC to support startups and innovators and researchers who are working on commercializable research. And by the end of it, if we are able to implement this project to the best of our abilities and achieve our milestones and indicators, we'll increase a lot of supply. But what will happen with that supply if there's no taker in the industry, there's no demand that's aggregated and organized to take those ideas, research, innovations, technologies forward? That's why I continue to focus in my solution. But I'm not just working with HSC, I'm working with a whole host of other bodies as well. And recently I started work, I designed a program for the agriculture sector in which I've created a blueprint how to revive the entire agriculture economy by leveraging science and technology and innovation in agriculture sector. And the first leg of that entire blueprint that I created is being rolled out as the Prime Minister's Billion Tree Honey program. And I believe similar approaches, value chain, cluster-based approaches can be developed for other value chains, non-agri value chains. We talked about a few value chains in Sialkot and other parts of Pakistan, but I totally agree with you. That needs to be done. But as Umar Jawatlani, I can only do so much. So I need to pick my battles, and I'm focusing a bit these days on startups. Yeah. Sir, you are muted, Dr. Nadeem.
Dr. Aftab Ahmed, please introduce yourself, ask your question.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Gigi, I can.
Okay, thank you very much for excellent talk, Dr. Umar. It's always a pleasure listening to you and your wonderful initiatives. And Dr. Nadeem is doing wonderful job, so I'm following him since long, and you as well. Actually, as during the presentation, Dr. Nadeem mentioned that in Pakistan, I think for the last 2-3 years, this is also what I have experienced for SMEs and startups, is the regulatory portion, because in Pakistan it's so strict and they don't understand your needs. That's why you suffer a lot. Like you have developed a technology, but that's not being translated only because of the regulations they are being implemented. In most of the countries, as you have also experienced, like if you talk about US, China, Korea, Japan, Singapore, and many other countries, if you develop something, then that can be like they give you provision to translate it, and then they further like if that is translatable, then they initially give you provision and then further like approval for that product. But in Pakistan, like we should understand, like I'm working in a biotech sector. So in biotech sector, you don't need to have a big factory. You can have a startup or a small company in a single room, just like if you are producing the stem cells or if you are producing the exosomes, for example. But our regulatory bodies, they don't understand that. So how to make them understand this? This is one thing. Another thing is like, this is also what I have experienced working in different countries. As you have mentioned that in US, I also been working in US, like I worked 10 years ago there. And most of the universities there, they have the laboratories from the industry. And when I came to Pakistan, we started asking the universities that they should have a good partnership with the industry. And even I myself requested a few of the universities that I can give the equipments and everything. And that could be a contribution from the industrial side. So industrial projects can be solved inside the university. And that's not being taken up. There are so many hurdles. You are sitting in HEC, I think you should like work on these issues. You know, the development in Pakistan, if you talk about the knowledge-based economy and other things, there should be a close association between the industries and the academia. And you have given the examples of one of the products that's being built in Sialkot. You know the situation of industry in Pakistan, like we don't have research and development. And for research and development, they can go to academia, but they are not taking the projects from the industry. So being in HEC, what do you think that how we can solve these kind of problems?
First of all, जी पहले तो जी HSC is not here to solve all these problems. HSC का तो अपना एक mandate हमें समझना चाहिए, and a lot of people are questioning whether HSC should even exist. ये तो universities को खुद अपनी चीजें करनी आगे, और चूंकि my universities in the past have become used to supported by the grants and the government and HSC. HSC को आप निकाल भी नहीं सकते एकदम, तो HSC अपना रोल एक प्ले कर सकती है, but over a period of time, I think universities need to graduate and become self-sustainable. So I personally believe HSC के रोल को हमें जितना कम से कम करना है over a period of time, हमें उस पर फोकस करना चाहिए, and universities को in this timeline हमें transform करना into truly entrepreneurial universities. who are not just creating knowledge for the heck of it, who are basically using that knowledge to create impact. That impact can mean some revenue for the universities as well. आप देखिए US universities ने अपनी endowments बनाई, वहाँ पे एक company जो है वहाँ पे जब वो unicorn बनती है, उनकी endowment को कितनी wealth मिलती है, and that wealth then is plowed back in doing R&D activity. तो यूनिवर्सिटीज को खुद भी एक इनिशिएटिव लेना है. आप जब अपनी यूनिवर्सिटी की पॉलिसीज, आईपी पॉलिसीज, एम्प्लॉयमेंट पॉलिसीज को सही तरह रिविजिट करते हैं. मैं भी गया हूँ ना 110 यूनिवर्सिटीज को मिल के आया फिजिकली, और ये सारा डेटा मैंने कलेक्ट किया. तो इवन द बेस्ट यूनिवर्सिटीज इन पाकिस्तान are struggling in figuring out what right IP policies they need to incentivize their faculty to go out and commercialize their research. This whole tenure track system is just pushing everyone to publish journals and get their promotions because there's an economic incentive for them. But at the same time, if you kind of give them some breathing space, that if you're able to commercialize, or if you're accepted into a program where your idea is going to be then used to commercialize, then you get a waiver from your teaching responsibilities and other publishing responsibilities that you have. And then you also give them an incentive that you get a portion of equity in that startup if a startup or a spin-off company is created based on the research of a faculty. Someone who has brilliant ideas can start churning out tons of ideas, take small equity stakes in lots of these businesses, or perhaps if it goes to licensing, have some revenue flowing to him. And ultimately, it's these economic incentives that drive human action and reaction. And so getting the हमारी यूनिवर्सिटी में आप देखें, एक यूनिवर्सिटी, वन ऑफ द लीडिंग यूनिवर्सिटी जिसने अपनी पॉलिसी बनाई है कि आपका रिसर्चर जो है 97.5% equity own कर सकता है in a spin-off company if that spin-off company is created with the base of with the use of his research. On the other side, another one of our leading university, has no IP policy. It's completely blank on this. अगर आप स्टैनफोर्ड की IP policy देखते हैं, वो क्या कर देते हैं? They don't allow faculty to own more than 20% in a company that's created out of. And there's a reason. अगर आप उनको 97.5% कहते हैं कि जी अपनी आप equity लें उस company में, वो कंपनियां बनाना शुरू कर देंगे, वो पढ़ाना छोड़ देंगे, बाकी responsible, तो आपने balancing करनी है. So these policies need to now be thought out. And by the way, 99% of researchers that I met in my cross-country visit to these universities, majority of the faculty and researchers felt that by law they are not allowed to create companies. So there's a difference between having an equity stake in a company and being part of the management and earning salary in a company. Yes, if you're an employee of the university, you cannot. And if you're part of a government university, you have to perhaps get NOCs and figure out what the policies are in your university and why government is holding you back. But in my report, I've given some guidelines how universities can create for-profit parallel structures, which ultimately creates incentive mechanisms for universities and researchers and even other knowledge workers, students who are operating those universities to work together to create commercial revenue. अब ये यूनिवर्सिटी का काम नहीं है कि कमर्शियल काम शुरू करते हैं, बट जो यूनिवर्सिटी में नॉलेज हो रही है, ultimately they need to take that knowledge out of the lab and bring it to the market, and these structures and guidelines will help them do that. ये मैंने एक पीछे एक स्क्रीन भी बनाई हुई है. ये मैंने इसलिए बनाई हुई है कि कुछ फैसिलिटीज मैंने बनाई है फॉर एग्रीकल्चर सेक्टर, फॉर क्लीन एनर्जी सेक्टर. ये मैंने एक फैसिलिटी बनाई थी फॉर क्लीन एनर्जी. एंड वो टेक्नोलॉजीज बहुत मौजूद है हमारे पास, बट वी डोंट हैव एन ऑर्गेनाइज्ड वे ऑफ आइडेंटिफाइंग व्हिच टेक्नोलॉजी हैज met the technology readiness level to be absorbed into some national program in which we are reliant on importing all kinds of renewable technologies. State Bank की requirement थी कि जी अगर आप कोई as a sponsor you're looking to put up a clean energy project, then 50% of the total project cost, offshore cost, needs to be mobilized before you can avail the local renewable energy financing facility. So they asked me to structure this euro-denominated foreign credit line and a credit guarantee facility. ये AFD Development Agency France से negotiate किया था State Bank ने, and I did the whole feasibility. I was the project lead for this. But इस तरह के programs, अभी हमारा Park Space Innovation के अंदर भी एक event हुआ जिसमें बहुत सी technologies आई हुई थी. Agriculture के अंदर जो हमने program अभी आपको Billion Tree का बताया, ये programs जो हैं ultimately what they do is they create demand for technology. जहाँ पे जो टेक्नोलॉजी बन रही है, अगर सप्लाई हम क्रिएट करते जाएंगे, बट दूसरी साइड पे वी आर नॉट क्रिएटिंग क्लस्टर्स व्हिच और प्रोग्राम्स व्हिच कैन एब्जॉर्ब दैट टेक्नोलॉजी. Ultimately we will not be able to create that scale and impact. So I think I've answered now both of your questions.
Sir, Dr. Nadeem, sir.
Dr. Hijazi, Vice Chancellor साहब, Dr. साहब बताइए.
Assalamualaikum ji. Can you hear me?
We can.
Acha, good. Thank you.
First of all, really, I appreciate PIDE for this wonderful exercise of opening up and listening to experts. And this is, I think, is the foundation we are laying down for a very prosperous economy. I would really give the credit to PIDE and Dr. Nadeem for it. I'm not an expert of SME, with the exception of that I have done a lot of training program with HEC on entrepreneurship. मेरे थोड़ी सी ऑब्जर्वेशन बेसिकली 2-3 चीज़ों के बारे में आप क्विकली देता हूँ, आप उसका जवाब भी अगर देना चाहें। पहली बात तो ये कि एंटरप्रेन्योर जो है वो एक मिनिमम एफर्ट से मार्केट में एंटर करना चाहता है। अगर आपके उसके लिए रेगुलेशंस जितनी बढ़ाते जाएंगे उतना वो डिफिकल्टली एंटर करेगा। और पाकिस्तान में जनरली चाहे रेगुलेशंस हैं या नहीं है, बट देयर इज लॉट ऑफ फियर कि देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ रेगुलेशंस। मैं पर्सनली एक एंटरप्रेन्योर एक एसएमई मैंने एस्टेब्लिश की और मुझे काफ़ी प्रॉब्लम्स आए मुख्तलिफ अदारों से, जो कि मुख्तलिफ किस्म के टैक्सेस और मुख्तलिफ किस्म के अजीब किस्म के लोग आ जाते हैं। So basically it was a very discouraging factor and I have to really withdraw that. Number 2, SME जो है इसका पाकिस्तान में एक वक्त था 60s वगैरह में हर चीज़ का कोई फादर होता था। अब इसका कोई फादर नहीं है। स्मेडा के नाम सुनते हैं लेकिन स्मेडा के अंदर आप वॉक इन करें तो वो आपको कुछ इन्फॉर्मेशन नहीं दे सकते। वो जनरल इधर उधर की बातें, रिसर्च रिपोर्ट्स की बातें सब कुछ हो रही होती हैं। तो आई थिंक कोई मिनिस्ट्री, कोई सियासतदान, कोई ब्यूरोक्रेट, कोई डिप्लोमेट, कोई एक्सपर्ट इसका फादर होना चाहिए। और आप बताइए कि क्यों ये फादर नहीं बन रहा, कि जो ओन करे और पब्लिकली हर वक्त अनाउंस करे कि इतने एसएमईज आ गए हैं, यहाँ पर पोटेंशियल है। एसएमई के आपने अभी एनर्जी की बात की, सोलर एनर्जी का बहुत बड़ा पोटेंशियल इस वक्त एसएमई के मार्केट में है, लेकिन इतनी बड़ी एप्रीहेंशन है कि आप किसी से पूछे वो कहते नहीं यार कुछ नहीं हो। मेरे पास लोग आते हैं, मैं कहता जाओ, कहते जी ये गवर्नमेंट नहीं कह रही तो कुछ भी नहीं हो रहा। मुझे याद है कि ग्रीस में जब इन्होंने सोलर वाटर हीटर लगाने शुरू किए थे आज से 20-25 साल पहले, तो गवर्नमेंट ने 3 महीने एडवर्टाइज किया था। 2 कंपनियों से बढ़ के 32 कंपनीज हो गई थी और वहाँ आप आज भी जाएं तो वहाँ हर छत के ऊपर सोलर वाटर हीटर लगा हुआ है। पाकिस्तान के अंदर ऐसी कोई गवर्नमेंट का अदारा नहीं। आई डोंट नो व्हाई, आप यू हैव टू आंसर मी कि क्या बात है कि गवर्नमेंट इसको प्रोटेक्ट नहीं कर रही। क्या शायद गवर्नमेंट डर रही है कि लोग सोलर लगा लेंगे तो वापडा की बिजली कौन खरीदेगा और फिर हम इसको कैसे वो करेंगे। नंबर 3, जो बात बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग है वो ये है कि जब आप यूनिवर्सिटीज की बात करते हैं, बिकॉज आई एम इन यूनिवर्सिटी और मैं ये जो इंक्यूबेशन वगैरह की मुख्तलिफ कमेटीज में मुख्तलिफ यूनिवर्सिटीज के हूँ, एंड मुझे जो सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम नजर आ रहा है वो लैंग्वेज का नजर आ रहा है। हम बातें करते हैं यहाँ बैठ के अंग्रेजी में, अंग्रेजी रिपोर्टें, अंग्रेजी एनालिसिस, अंग्रेजी सारा कुछ। जो एसएमई सेक्टर है वो 99% उर्दू मीडियम है। अब जो इंक्यूबेशन में भी जो गैप है, मुझे बड़ा मजा आया, वहाँ पर एक जगह मीटिंग हुई, कुछ इंक्यूबेशन के कुछ लोग आए हुए थे, उनको अंग्रेजी नहीं आती थी, इधर जो दूसरे थे वो उर्दू नहीं बोल सकते थे क्योंकि टर्मिनोलॉजी उनके ज़हन में उर्दू की नहीं थी। वो ऐसा गैप था मीटिंग टेबल के ऊपर, कभी अंग्रेजी चल रही है, कभी उर्दू चल रही है। जब उर्दू चल रही है तो वो गौर से सुन रहे हैं, अंग्रेजी चल रही तो हम गौर से सुन रहे। तो ये एक्चुअली ये एक बहुत बड़ा क्राइसिस है पाकिस्तान में। एसएमई सेक्टर में कम से कम इसको खत्म करना चाहिए और एसएमई की जो भी एक्टिविटीज हैं वो सारी उर्दू में होनी चाहिए। अदरवाइज आप एसएमई को बिल्कुल भी किसी तरीके से ऊपर नहीं ला सकते। यूनिवर्सिटीज जो है वो यूनिवर्सिटीज का भी यही प्रॉब्लम है कि वो भी अंग्रेजी मीडियम है सारी। तो यूनिवर्सिटी के प्रोफेसर पे आप एक्सपेक्ट ना ही करें तो अच्छा है। मैंने बहुत इस पर टकरें मारी हैं और मैं इस नतीजे पहुंचा हूँ कि एक प्रोफेसर को एसएमई प्रमोट करने के लिए, बनाने के लिए उसको बड़ा एक स्पेशल होना चाहिए। उर्दू मीडियम भी होना चाहिए, इंग्लिश मीडियम भी होना चाहिए, वो पंजाबी भी जानता हो और वो क्या। तो माय क्वेश्चन इज बेसिकली कि इन प्रॉब्लम्स का, ये इंग्लिश मीडियम वाले प्रॉब्लम्स का, फादर होने का प्रॉब्लम का, और ये जो 5 साल के लिए टैक्स फ्री सॉर्ट ऑफ एनवायरनमेंट देने का, हाउ इट इज पॉसिबल। थैंक यू।
तो सर पहले तो आपका बिल्कुल 100% सही ऑब्जर्वेशन है अक्रॉस ऑल द डिफरेंट एस्पेक्ट्स यू मेंशन्ड। मैं हुकूमत के बिहाफ पे तो नहीं बोल सकता, बट हुकूमत को एक चैंपियन तो बनाना है। हुकूमत ने बनाया एक चैंपियन। The Minister of Commerce is the person who's overseeing the whole SME, and he created an SME council. But the people who have been driving the SME agenda for State Bank, for other organizations in Pakistan, almost 99% of the work done at the state bank level for SME, I'm the guy who led all those projects. So I've connected with the SME Council from the HSC platform, but ideally, they should have identified the people who've been involved. Problem Pakistan का अलमिया जो मुझे समझ आता है, जो सिर्फ एक अलमिया है, वो ये है कि we have all the wrong people at the wrong places. If we can get a system where we try to get the right people at the right places, I think Pakistan has tremendous potential. Starting from universities to all key institutions around. मेरा ज़ाती ख्याल है कि जी हमने सही लोगों को मौका नहीं दिया और गलत लोग गलत जगहों पे बैठे हुए हैं। दूसरी आपकी जो बात है ये SME की inability to absorb innovation, they don't come from formal education backgrounds. And I touched upon this topic under the National Idea Lab. What I proposed is creating a matchmaking program between startups and SMEs. एक एग्जांपल देता हूँ, फूड सेक्टर का देता हूँ एग्जांपल। बहुत से आपके होल इन द वॉल काइंड ऑफ रेस्टोरेंट्स, वेरी गुड रेस्टोरेंट्स. When I moved from Karachi to Islamabad, one thing I really missed was food in Karachi, and Karachi food was really good in so many places. But अगर आपको एक स्टार्टअप आती है, एक फ्रेंचाइज मॉडल बिल्ड करती है, जिस तरह एक छोटा सा ठेला था जिसमें स्टूडेंट बिरयानी को उन्होंने फ्रेंचाइज मॉडल के थ्रू स्केल किया. I'm just saying कि वो छोटी SME जो है, जो ऑपरेट कर रही है, जब आप उसमें एक फॉर्मल एक इनोवेटिव माइंड लेके आते हैं, तो it unleashes tremendous opportunities for the SME and for that youth, for that startup. And that SME may not have the ability to go through a formal incubation program, but when you pair them up and tie the knot through an equity distribution model, defining key milestones, investing schedules. These are transactional activities which I specialize in doing. So, but point ये है कि जब तक हम इस तरह की चीज़ों को नहीं प्रमोट करते और अपनी SMEs को में इनोवेशन नहीं लाते, क्योंकि आप उनको एक फॉर्मल इंक्यूबेशन या एजुकेशन प्रोग्राम के थ्रू नहीं आप गुजार सकते. They're already doing business and they don't want to come into this whole discussion and nonsense of incubation, to be honest. तो वो स्टार्टअप्स कर रही हैं और स्टार्टअप्स जो हैं उनके पास प्रैक्टिकल रियलिटी नहीं है, मार्केट रिसर्च नहीं है. They live a sheltered life. कभी उन्होंने मार्केट में जाके काम नहीं किया, so when you combine the two, you're able to bring an experience from the markets, ground the startup in practical reality of what the real economy challenges are, and then we let the innovative minds of the youth and their ability to bring and understand innovation and its application in the SME sector, unleash potentials for both sides and create win-win situations for everyone. कितनी आपकी SMEs हैं और कितनी हमारी startups बन रही हैं, and there is no connectivity, there is no platform. So hopefully this platform that we are trying to create with SMEDA and HSC and the National Innovation Lab will do something. Yeah.
Omar Sahab, let me bring in the last question. Dr. Samar Fatma. Dr. Samar Fatma. Introduce yourself, please. Ask your question.
Yes, sir. I am Dr. Samar Fatma, Tenure Associate Professor from University of Gujarat. So this is my second webinar which I am attending, and I have no more knowledge like you, but my basic question, as I want to submit some project in HSC, but I am feeling problem in registration as I want to register companies. Can you guide how to register company and how to difficulty when I register a company?
ठीक है उमर साहब को समझ आ गई है, वो कर देंगे आंसर. उमर साहब जल्दी से आंसर कर दें.
मैंने ये अपनी ईमेल दे दी है डॉक्टर समर. ये this is a off topic kind of registration is a very simple process. I'll help you. Just write to me. If it's a HSC related question, then write to me on my HSC email. If it's not an HSC related question, I've given you my other email as well.
ठीक है जी.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Umar Sahab. Thank you very much. I think it's been a great discussion, a wonderful discussion. However, I do feel there are a few things, Umar Sahab, that I might mention to you before we depart. One is we talk about clustering in many ways, but the one thing that we don't do cluster at all is idea formation. So as far as SMEs goes, we've got SMEDA, we've got State Bank, we've got this, we've got that, Ministry of Commerce, etc., HEC. Where is the clustering there? Why is State Bank doing SMEs? By the law, their job is monetary policy. Why are they getting into something else? I've been saying this for a long time. What is SMEDA doing? It's been there for 40 years. Nobody's evaluated, nobody's assessed it. Secondly, we talk about universities. Universities themselves are not clusters. We are setting up more universities than popcorn stands. We have more. HEC is responsible for that. When is HEC going to declare a moratorium on setting up universities? No university is a cluster of skills, Umar Saab, you know that. To expect them to perform research, etc., is crap. I look through 10 universities today, their faculty. None of them have a faculty of any sorts. There are no professors in the entire system. We are trying to create professors like McDonald's burgers. Give them PhDs, send them overseas. I mean, it's like fast food professors. And then we think they're professors. I mean, come on, I've just received a letter from the HEC saying, set up another university. Guys, the fault, dear Brutus, is in us and not in our stars. HEC is the fault. This place that manufactures fast food universities, I want to use an expletive here, I want. The second thing is industry-university collaboration. These slogans I'm sick of. What do you mean by industry-university collaboration? First of all, you don't want an university. You want a building. There's no university. University is a set of professors, a cluster. Umar Saab, to use your own terminology, university is a cluster. Show me a cluster. Then I'll believe we have a university. There's no cluster. Secondly, industry. Why should industry come to us? I talk to industrialists every day. They won't even give us a single penny. They will not give any university a single penny. Why? Because they operate on government subsidies. They're all on the EAC. They make the policy. So why should they give us a subsidy? They make policies. They make policies for themselves. It's self, profiting policies. That's all they do, and that's fine. You're absolutely wrong, people in wrong places. Absolutely right, 100% correct. But we fragmented policy, we fragmented universities, and we talk about clustering, God knows what, and we talk about industry collaboration, industry-university collaboration. None of this is going to happen because our DNA, our entire physical infrastructure, the way we organize ourselves is all wrong. We have no respect for academics. We treat them like machines that they will somehow perform. How can they perform? They don't even have a place to perform. There is not a single cluster anywhere that I've seen in Pakistan that is capable of talking. I mean, in fact, for example, think about it this way. This webinar today, for example, is a webinar in public policy. I guarantee you, Umar Saab, right now, you correct me, please yell if I'm wrong. There is not a single State Bank guy here, even though you say State Bank is interested. There is not a single SMEDA guy here. Folks, yell if I'm wrong. Raise your hand, say something, put it in the chat box. There's not a single donor here. Where do these guys learn? There's a huge amount of problem here. I'm sorry. Umar Saab, thank you very much. A wonderful webinar. I learned a lot. I do these things because I want to learn, not because of anything else. But I feel very despondent when I see that nobody wants to learn in this country. We all think it's a quick fix. There's no such thing as a quick fix. There's no quick fix university. There's no quick fix anything. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Umar. Umar, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful webinar. You've done a lot of work. We must talk offline how we can help you extend this work, how we can publish it, how we can advance it further. You got a lot of material there. We shall, inshallah, do something with it. All the best, folks. Thank you. Bye-bye.